Welcome to Lecture 7 of Biology 116, entitled Plant Diversity 1. As we've covered the unicont diversity side of animal diversity and life diversity as a whole, we're now going to be shifting gears and focusing on how plants originated and diversified to become some of the most successful organisms on planet Earth. In order to understand this, we first have to ground our knowledge on a basic understanding of where they came from, their origins. And we'll do that in this first introductory flowchart, which we'll just entitle Introduction. So the big question we have to keep in mind, as we did throughout unicont diversity, is why are plants successful? Why are they everywhere? Why are they so pervasive? Throughout every single part of Earth contains some sort of plant-like material or organism. So we have to ask ourselves that question constantly, and through this introduction we'll get a general idea of why plants came from where they came, and also why that led to their ultimate success all over planet Earth. So, first and foremost, we have to establish the fact, and this is something we did in a prior lecture actually, that they all came from an organism known as charophytes. Now, this root right here of P-H-Y-T-E is a Greek root that simply refers to plants. So anytime you see phyte or phytes, we're talking about plants. Charophytes were those protists, those green algae, that we said in the protist lecture we'll get back to when we talk about land plants and their diversification and origination. This is exactly what we mean. Charophytes are simply the closest known relative to land plants. So we'll write that down. Closest relative to land plants. And the majority of this lecture will be devoted to looking at land plants. So now we've already established that there will be some sort of last universal common ancestor for all land plants. That would be a charophyte, a green algae. Now, speaking of charophytes, we have to first also understand what charophytes consist of. In essence, we have to look at the charophyte characteristics and how those are going to relate to land plants later on. So first we'll establish some basic characteristics that all charophytes have, and we'll look at that versus how plants today have the characteristics similar to the charophytes way back when. So the big thing about charophytes that really helps them relate, let's say, to land plants is the following. They inhabit, so they live in shallow waters. Something you have to keep in mind is that most of life, way back when, a long time ago, was water-based. Everything lived in an aquatic environment. The charophytes are no different. They were green algae, mostly in water. But there's a specific type of water that they lived in. They inhabited shallow waters. Now, because of this, these shallow waters would be located around the edges of ponds and lakes. So we're talking freshwater here. Ponds/lakes. So now you can already start thinking, well, we're going to try to eventually get to land plants. We have these green algae that inhabited shallow waters already close to land, these edges of ponds and lakes. Therefore, we know for a fact that in this area, drying out can occur. So these, whatever organisms living here, they have the potential of drying out. Drying out can certainly occur at the edges of a lake or a pond and in shallow waters. So what's going to happen is a basic evolutionary mechanism that we know a great deal of from Bio 1, and that is natural selection. NS, natural selection, will eventually, and it did, favors individuals, so INDS for individuals, that can withstand harsh conditions. Things that can survive and reproduce and continue with their adaptations, let's say. Natural selection favors individuals that withstand harsh conditions. What harsh condition are we referring to in the charophytes? That is the fact that they can possibly dry out. They live in these shallow waters. So what happens is, because charophytes live here and succeed here, the land plants are what's going to evolve from the charophyte origin. Land plants evolve. Basic evolutionary mechanism of natural selection, picking and selecting charophytes that are successful at preventing drying out, that are successful at growing maybe even closer and closer towards land, not even near the water anymore, and eventually you get the evolution of land plants as a whole. So that's a major characteristic. Where they live has led to the land plants that we see today, or where they lived at one point. Another major characteristic that is important to understand is about structure, and that is their sporopollenin. So this is a new structure that we have never talked about, and let's see what this means. A sporopollenin is simply going to be a polymer layer of protection. So a polymer is many monomers combined together, and this is a polymer layer of protection specifically. Okay? And we know that protection is a big important part of any survival and reproduction of any organism. And the key idea about the sporopollenin is that the protection is specific to a very important part. The sporopollenin prevents, that's the key here, it prevents exposed zygotes from drying out. And we of course know that zygotes are the fertilized sperm and egg of two separate charophytes. And so these are eventually going to develop into a fully developed charophyte, right? But you have to make sure that they survive and have the opportunity to develop. How do you do that? You ensure that they have something that prevents drying out and prevents them specifically through this polymer layer of protection known as the sporopollenin. So that's a big thing that charophytes all have that has led to their success. Even the youngest of charophytes, the single zygote of a charophyte, has the ability to prevent themselves from drying out. That clearly shows that land plants will evolve from this origin, this protist green algae origin. Finally, last thing about the introduction is to, now that we've established the fact that charophytes have these unique characteristics that make them successful in their specific, let's say, ecological niche, we're going to now look at how land plants, more explicitly now, how land plants and charophytes are similar. So we already sort of hinted upon this, but now we're going to put some real facts towards their similarity. Land plants and charophytes similarities. So let's see. First and foremost, both possess a similar structure, and that structure is the following. They both have a ring of cellulose synthesizing proteins. Cellulose synthesizing proteins. So a key structural characteristic of all plants, and cell walls specifically, remember plant cells have cell walls, is the fact that they have cellulose within them. Cellulose is great for structure. Okay? This specific cellulose originally starts within the plasma membrane of these plants and charophytes, and then eventually from here you make cellulose microfibrils. And microfibrils are just a fancy way of saying structural, subunits that are going to really make sure that this cell is sturdy and strong. So land plants and charophytes, you would say, have strong and sturdy cells because of cellulose synthesizing proteins. And cellulose, as we remember, is a polymer of glucose that has those strong beta-glycosidic bonds between each glucose monomer to create a polymer known as cellulose. Okay, in addition, they both have similar flagellated, and so the idea behind the flagellated is that this is for motility, right? Don't forget that. Similar flagellated sperm cells. So both land plants and charophytes possess that. And lastly, they both have the following: the formation of a phragmoplast. So this is another new term to remember. Phragmoplast. What is the purpose of a phragmoplast? A phragmoplast is simply a group of microtubules. So microtubules are usually structural, like I think of them as like highways of cells, and they really help promote the organelles moving from one place to another and really promote the integrity of the cell. Make sure that it doesn't just collapse on itself. So that's what microtubules really are. And in addition, the specific formation of the phragmoplast is going to occur at a certain point. It forms between the daughter nuclei during cell division. Daughter nuclei during CD for cell division. So what we mean here is that when a cell is dividing, specifically a land plant cell or a charophyte cell, through a regular old cell division process, there's going to be a layer sort of that develops in between the two daughter nuclei that are going to pop off from each other. That is specifically referred to as the cell plate region. So phragmoplast and cell plate, something to definitely remember. The cell plate forms in the middle of the phragmoplast, forms in middle of phragmoplast. And finally, this cell plate is going to eventually, this is a key characteristic of all plant cells, give rise, something we always talk about in the origination of anything, give rise to what? Give rise to new cell walls of daughter cells. That's key here. So now we have the cell walls that are so characteristic of all plant cells, of the daughter cells. And that's our basic introduction to land plants and charophytes and how they're similar and how they sort of originated from one another. One thing I want to make sure is clear is where we are in terms of development. It might have gotten lost in this idea of charophytes and land plants and just throwing all this information out there, but it's very simple. And then I'll sort of box this in over here. It's the fact that we started off as a eukaryotic cell, which is something you should be very comfortable doing by now. And the eukaryotic cell was specifically a protist, okay, specific protist, and we know all about them. And the type of protist that developed from there in order to give us land plants was the Archaeplastida. Let's not forget that. And from Archaeplastida, we had the origination of the charophytes. And from the charophytes, what do we get? We now get our entire next two lectures, the land plants. So now from there we get land plants. So that's our basic evolutionary time scale, chronological order, let's say, of how things developed. And we'll continue our discussion on these land plants and plant diversity in the next video.